They fired me in 3 minutes, no handshake, no thank you. Just a manila envelope and a quiet escort to the door. But as I walked out, one by one, the entire flight crew started refusing to fly. And that was only the beginning. If you think, this is just a story about losing a job. It's not. It's about what happens when the person they tried to erase turns out to be the one holding everything together. You're being let go, Captain Merritt. The words didn't hit like a punch. They didn't explode, didn't echo. They just settled. Like ash after a fire, weightless but final. I sat across from Lyle Grant in his office on the top floor of Sierra West's headquarters. Everything about the room screamed order. Sleek desk, glass walls, polished floors. But the man behind the desk couldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at his screen like the numbers there might protect him. I didn't speak. Not yet. I let the silence stretch, like the seconds before a storm hits. I'd flown through more turbulence than this. Mechanical failures, lightning strikes, wind shear on final approach. But this was different. Lyle cleared his throat. Your position is being eliminated as part of a company-wide restructuring. Your compensation package no longer aligns with our growth model. I noticed the way his fingers tapped against the table. Nervous, mechanical. He slid a manila envelope across the desk. Details are inside. HR is expecting you downstairs. 18 years. I'd given this airline 18 years. I had flown every route from Seattle to Sao Paulo. I'd trained captains, rewritten protocols, flown red-eyes over Thanksgiving because no one else would. I had signed off on the final simulator checks of most of the pilots now filling Sierra West's cockpits. And I was being dismissed like a broken autopilot module. Quietly. Efficiently. Outside the window, a familiar hum drew my attention. A 737. Taxied onto the runway. Flight 2249 to Denver. I knew that plane. More than that, I knew the woman flying it. Captain Elena Brooks. She'd been fresh out of the Air Force when I started mentoring her. Nervous in the sim, unsure of herself. I'd seen her blossom over 2 years into one of the best damn pilots I'd ever certified. And there she was, guiding 80 tons of aircraft down the taxiway. Clean, steady, capable. I felt something twist in my chest. Not bitterness, not quite pride. Something between anything else? I asked, my voice calm. Maybe too calm. Lyle finally looked up just long enough to say, "We'll need your uniform returned before you leave the premises." I stood, buttoned my jacket, reflex even now, and walked out without a word. Ellen from HR was waiting just outside, clipboard in hand. She gave me that soft, neutral smile that HR people are trained to deliver. Equal parts apology and procedure. "This way, Captain," she said, and I followed. We walked past framed photographs in the hallway. Milestone flights, smiling crews, few awards. One photo stopped me in my tracks. It was from 2007. My first long-haul crew, arms around each other beside the tail of a Sierra West 737. I was in the center, one arm slung around a first officer who would later become a chief. Pilot, my uniform looked new then, my smile less practiced. Back when I still thought this company meant something. In the locker room, I opened my personal cabinet. My flight bag sat neatly on the shelf. Above it, a photo of my daughter Katie on her college move-in day. I took off my jacket slowly, folded it precisely, cuffs aligned, seams crisp. It was muscle memory, learned in the military, sharpened over decades. Then I reached up to remove my hat. As I did, I noticed something I hadn't thought about in years. Taped to the inside of the locker door was an old photo, me and the crew, from my very first Sierra West flight. 5 young pilots grinning in the morning sun, standing on the tarmac like we'd conquered the world. Most of them had moved on. Better airlines, teaching gigs. Some left aviation entirely. I was the last, one still here, until today. I stared at the photo for a long moment. My hands didn't tremble, but something deep in my chest did. Here's what most people don't understand about flying. Gravity never quits. No matter how high you go, No matter how long you've been in the air, gravity is always waiting, patient and absolute. But not. All descents come with alarms. Some happen quietly. Some feel like someone reaching up and flipping a switch, and suddenly you're not flying anymore. You're falling. And sometimes the hardest part isn't the landing. It's stepping away from the cockpit for the last time and realizing you're not the one who changed altitude. The sky did. The drive home felt wrong. Not longer, not harder. Just wrong. Like I was watching my life through the windshield but no longer part of it. The roads were familiar, but I felt like a visitor. Stoplights turned green. Joggers crossed streets. Kids waited for buses with backpacks that looked too big for their shoulders. It was a Thursday morning like any other, except everything in my world had just stopped. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the ignition. For a long time, I just sat there. My hand stayed on the steering wheel even after the engine had gone silent, like I was still holding on to something that had already moved on. The house was quiet, as it had been for years. Katie was away at school. Mara had left 3 years ago. We hadn't fought. We'd just drifted, like planes on different headings, slowly but surely losing radar contact. In the kitchen, I put the kettle on and reached for the old hand grinder. I could have used the machine, but there was something about grinding the beans, heating the water, pouring the brew by hand. It gave me back a sense of control, small, but real, familiar. Coffee had always been part of my morning routine before. A flight, a ritual, not a requirement. Something stable in a job full of variables. I leaned against the counter, letting the steam rise into my face. Then my eyes drifted to the stack of unopened mail. That's when I saw it. A white envelope with gold trim, the logo of Northern Air printed in the corner. I remembered it now. A few months ago, they'd reached out. Senior captain role, higher salary, better hours, flexible schedule. Katie's college was closer to one of their hubs. Mara might have even reconsidered things. I'd never even opened, because back then, I couldn't imagine flying for anyone else. I picked up the envelope now, still sealed. The corners were a little bent, like it had waited patiently to be acknowledged. I set it down again, untouched. I walked to the back porch with my coffee and sat under the awning, staring at the mountains in the distance. The snow line was receding. Spring was trying to break through. I started thinking about where it all began. At 19, I was working nights at a tiny regional airport, refueling prop planes, cleaning lavatories, sweeping hangars. I smelled like jet fuel for years. Every spare dollar went to flight lessons. My first logbook still has coffee stains and oil smudges on the cover. At 25, I was flying freight across the Midwest. Ice storms, runway blackouts, cargo shifts, dare. Not glamorous, but it taught me discipline, humility, and the weight of responsibility when you're alone at altitude and the radios go dark. Then came the Air Force. 11 years. Long missions, tight formations, combat zones, losses, lessons. I came out of it with a steel spine and a better understanding of what leadership really meant, and scars I didn't always talk about. When I transitioned to commercial flying, wasn't sure I'd fit in. Then I met Henry Weston. He didn't look like a founder, didn't act like a CEO. He wore old pilot boots, carried a worn logbook, and shook hands like a man who still remembered throttle control. "You've got the eyes of someone who's flown through weather," he told me. "I have." "Good," he said. "I want you to build me a crew, one I'd trust with my wife and grandkids in the back row." That was all the mission I needed. For 18 years, I trained everyone from fresh-faced flight school grads to hardened ex-military flyers. I rewrote training manuals. I designed safety drills. I sat with new pilots after their first engine failures and talked them through the adrenaline, not because someone told me to, because that's what loyalty looked like to me. I said no to Northern Air, to Delta, to a private charter group that promised double my salary. Because Sierra West was home. Or so I thought. Now I'm not sure anymore. The envelope sat on the table inside, still unopened, and I found myself asking something I'd never asked before. What's the shelf life of loyalty in a world run by spreadsheets? Didn't go back upstairs to start a rebellion. Honestly, I don't know why I went at all. Habit, maybe. After 18 years, your body develops reflexes even when your mind's falling apart. I told myself I just needed to clear out my locker. The pilot's lounge was nearly empty when I pushed open the door. The coffee machine was making its usual wheezing noises, and someone had left the weather radar running on the overhead screen. The room smelled like burned toast and cheap roast, the same way it always had at 5:30 a.m. before early pushes. I stepped inside and took a breath. Then a voice behind me said, "Captain Merritt?" I turned. Thomas Blake stood at the coffee machine holding a paper cup like it had betrayed him. He looked stunned. "Is it true?" I gave him a small nod. "Effective this morning. They fired you?" "Restructured," I said. Clean word for a dirty decision. Thomas set the coffee down without drinking. Jesus. He reached for his phone. I waved him off. "It's fine. I'm just here to grab my things." He ignored me. He was already texting. Within minutes, the door opened again. Catherine Lowe walked in, jaw clenched tight. Behind her came Daniel Reyes, Elena Brooks, and James Talbot. Pilots I had trained. Pilots I had certified. Pilots I trusted. They didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, watching me like I was a ghost who wasn't supposed to be walking through walls. "I don't understand," Catherine finally said. "Why wouldn't they at least notify the team? You're in charge of most of our training modules." "They don't need me anymore," I replied. "Or at least they don't want to pay what they think I'm worth." "That's bullshit," Daniel muttered. "No," I said quietly. "It's business." The phrase tasted like iron. Elena stepped closer. "You trained me. You're the reason I survived that bird strike over Phoenix last year. You stayed late. You walked me through emergency procedures again and again until I got it right." I held up a hand. "Please, don't turn this into something bigger. You all have careers to think about. Flights to prep. Don't get caught in this." James folded his arms. "Maybe we don't want to just walk away." "You're good pilots," I told them. "Don't let this distract you." "Then why are we all still standing here?" Catherine asked, her voice low but steady. That's when I realized none of them had sat down. None had reached for their flight bags. No one was checking their watches or heading for the doors. They weren't staging anything. They weren't trying to make a point. They just didn't want to leave. It hit me like cold air against windshield glass. These weren't my subordinates, they were my people. "I'm not asking you to protest," I said. "I'm not even asking you to care. I'm just here to clean out a locker." "No," Thomas said. "You're here because somewhere deep down you knew we'd show up." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. Instead, I walked over to the couch, near the whiteboard, and sat. Slowly, like I was still waiting to wake up from this whole thing. They followed. Someone pulled down a flight schedule. Catherine grabbed a marker and started writing. Daniel flipped open a laptop and started searching policy docs. Elena began listing every recent change in simulator hours. James muttered about maintenance, delay memos. No one told them to do anything, but they were doing it anyway. I leaned back and watched the room move like a crew inside a cockpit after an unexpected alert. Focused, fluid, coordinated without command. And for the first time since the meeting with Lyall, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt seen. This wasn't just loyalty, it was legacy. And maybe I wasn't done yet. I was still in my car, parked under a row of trembling cottonwoods near the edge of the employee lot, when my phone rang. Henry Weston. The name on the screen pulled at something deeper than surprise. It stopped me mid-thought. I hadn't spoken to Henry in over a year, since he officially stepped back and let his son take the reins, I answered. "Henry," his voice was low and clipped. "Jack, Evan tells me you've decided to retire." I leaned my head back against the headrest. "That's not true." A pause stretched between us. "I didn't think so," Henry finally said. "But I had to hear it from you." "I was restructured," I said, "like a spreadsheet column." His breath came out sharp. "You built that training department. You rewrote their safety protocols. You turned a collection of pilots into a crew. And they discard you like it's an optimization algorithm?" It's not your company anymore, I reminded him. Clearly, he said, and not for the better. I stared out the windshield. The clouds were low, gray, and unsure, just like me. Henry's voice softened. Jack, I can't undo what Evan's done, but I can offer you something else, a clean start. I'm listening. There's a company called Ether Air. Young, smart. They're building a new kind of airline, focused on chartered premium travel, high safety margins, lean bureaucracy. Their CEO, Victor Tran, is an ex-aeronautical engineer. Good head, better heart. He's looking for someone to build a training program from the ground up. My first reaction was silence, not rejection, not excitement, just, wait. Henry, I said, I just got kicked out of the cockpit. I'm not sure I'm ready to walk into another. You're not walking into anything, he said. You'd be building it, on your terms. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. It's too soon. Then don't decide yet, but don't sign anything with Sierra West either. Give yourself the weekend. He paused again. I'm sorry, Jack, for all of this. So am I. When the call ended, I stayed in the car a little longer. My hands rested on the steering wheel, not holding, just remembering the shape, the feel, the habit of control. Didn't know if I wanted to lead anything again. I just knew I didn't want to be invisible. My phone buzzed again. Catherine, you should come back upstairs. Why? 'Cause the lounge is full, and they're not leaving. What do you mean? I mean, they brought a whiteboard. I blinked. Then I started the engine. Back on the third floor, the hallway was alive with low voices and movement. When I stepped into the pilot's lounge, I saw it immediately. The whiteboard had been pulled to the center of the room. Catherine was writing on it. Dates, timelines, policy changes. Thomas was printing copies of old simulator logs. Elena had her laptop open, flipping between FAA directives and Sierra West internal memos. No one had told them to do this. They had organized themselves. I watched from the doorway for a moment. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Catherine noticed me and gestured me over. We've been reviewing every major training cut since Lyle stepped in. Why? To build a case, she said, to show a pattern. A pattern of what? Negligence, deviation from federal standards, and worst of all, arrogance. I shook my head, overwhelmed but quietly amazed. I didn't start this. You didn't need to, she said. You already built it. Then she handed me a dry erase marker. Want to help? I didn't answer. I just stepped forward. The door flew open with the kind of force usually reserved for emergencies. Lyle Grant stood there, flushed and breathless, like a man who expected chaos and planned to meet it with control. But the room didn't erupt. It was too calm for that. I was leaning against the counter near the coffee pot. Catherine had just written sim time reduction, 27%, on the whiteboard. A dozen pilots were seated or standing around it, focused, quiet, composed. Lyle blinked, scanning the room like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. What is this? He snapped. Why aren't you all at your gates? No one answered right away. The hum of the vending machine buzzed in. The silence. A paper from the printer fluttered to the floor. Then Thomas Blake stood up, smooth and steady, like he was making a routine announcement over the PA. We're not flying today. Lyle stared at him. Excuse me? Thomas didn't flinch. We are invoking our right to refuse duty under FAA Regulation 121.135 and our union agreement. We are not satisfied with the current safety margin. Until it's addressed, we're not getting in the air. This is absurd, Lyle said. This is emotional drama. This is about Captain Merritt, isn't it? Everyone turned toward me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. This isn't about him, Catherine said, rising now. It's about simulator hours being cut below industry minimums, about maintenance reports being inconsistently logged, about fatigue, protocol being ignored. Lyle stepped farther into the room. You're not management. You don't decide when to fly. You are paid to execute flight schedules, not question the algorithm. And we're paid, Daniel cut in, to protect passengers' lives, which includes refusing to fly when there's cause for concern. Lyle's voice sharpened. You are all contractually obligated to report to your scheduled flights. I cleared my throat, slow and deliberate. Unless there are valid safety concerns, in which case, FAA rules state that any flight crew has the right and the obligation not to fly. He turned to me like I'd slapped him. You're not even employed here anymore. I'm still a certified instructor, I said, and a citizen with the right to observe a legal safety stand-down. Then another voice joined the fray. What's going on here? Evan Weston. Perfect hair, tailored blazer, clipboard under. His arm like he was ready to solve problems by writing someone up. I hadn't seen him in person since the day his father introduced us, back when Sierra West still had a soul. He surveyed the room. His eyes locked briefly with mine before moving. Catherine stepped forward and handed him the compiled list. Our concerns with documentation. Evan flipped through it like he was browsing a brochure. This is a company, not a crusade, he said. It's not a family. It's a business. People come and go. That's how systems evolve. And sometimes, I said, they collapse when you ignore the people who hold them up. Evan didn't respond. He addressed the room. You have 1 hour to return to duty. Any pilot who fails to report will face disciplinary review. Nobody moved. He took a step forward. This is insubordination. No, Catherine said calmly. This is a formal safety stand down under Union Code and federal aviation law. He turned to her, ready to argue. But something about the way she stood, shoulders squared, hands at her sides, made him stop. The room held its breath. No shouting. No outbursts. Just silence. And not the silence of fear. The silence of pilots who had already decided. I looked around the room, at the people I had trained, the people I had mentored, people who could have walked away, kept their heads down, flown, their roots, but they didn't, they stood. And in that stillness, I felt the most powerful thing I've ever felt in a cockpit, or out of one. Conviction. We weren't fighting. We were simply refusing to take off without clarity, and that more than anything is what flying safely has always been about. By the time the shouting had stopped and the executives had retreated, the lounge had transformed into something else entirely. Not just a waiting room, not even a protest. A war room. Catherine was hunched over her laptop in the corner, fingers flying, her brow furrowed like she was defusing a bomb. I walked over and stood behind her, watching rows of maintenance records scroll past on her screen. Something's not right, she muttered. What am I looking at? I asked. These are maintenance reports. Aircraft IDs, timestamps, flagged issues. I pulled everything from the last 4 months. And? She opened 2 files side by side. Look here, Aircraft 5203, initial log from the hangar tech. Flagged a hydraulic pressure fault, categorized as critical. See, I nodded. Now look at the record that was filed with the FAA. She clicked, same entry, same date, but the language had changed. Non-critical advisory. I read aloud. Monitored, no action required. My gut tightened. That's not a downgrade. That's a lie. She clicked again. Another aircraft, same pattern. Engine temperature irregularities reclassified as within range. Brake issues retime-stamped. Inspection intervals delayed. Each alteration subtle. But cumulative? Catastrophic. I leaned in. How many of these? Are there? She hesitated. More than I want to count. And all of them started appearing after they rolled out the new maintenance tracking software. I closed my eyes. That software was Lyle's pet project, sold to the board as a data-driven optimization tool. In truth, it was a filter, a gatekeeper, a mask. Do you think it's manual? I asked. No, she said. It's automated. The system reclassifies based on internal thresholds we didn't set. We stood in silence for a moment, staring at the screen. This isn't just policy negligence, I said. This is criminal, Catherine's voice dropped. This could kill people. And if it hasn't already, I added, it's just a matter of time. She started backing up files onto a flash drive. I watched as folder after folder filled with data, PDFs, audit logs, original reports with metadata still intact. Daniel and Elena joined us. "What's going on?" "We've got manipulated safety data," I said. "It's not just training they cut, it's truth." Catherine handed the flash drive to Thomas, who had just walked over with a flight bag slung over one shoulder. "Hold this," she said. Thomas took it like she'd handed him something radioactive. "You sure? Keep it on you," she said. "If they shut me out of the system, you'll be our backup." He slid it into the inner pocket of his flight bag, zipped it, and gave a single nod. Nothing dramatic. But I saw the look in his eyes. He understood what it meant. We all did. This had stopped being about me a long time ago. It wasn't about loyalty anymore, or even fairness. It was about the soul of the profession. The reason we get up at 4 a.m. and suit up. The reason we rehearse emergency landings and checklist drills until they haunt our dreams. Flying is beautiful, but it's never casual. It's only safe because of the people who refuse to cut corners when no one's looking. And here we were, staring at proof that someone at the top had decided safety was too expensive to maintain. Catherine looked at me. "We need to send this to the FAA, not wait for Sierra West to clean it up." I nodded. "I'll make the call." I stepped out of the lounge and found a quiet hallway, then dialed the number from the FAA investigator I knew from a training conference years ago. She'd once told me, "If something doesn't smell right, call me before it burns." When she picked up, I said, "Lisa, this is Captain Jack Merritt. I've got something you need to see." The Ether Air headquarters didn't feel like an airline office. It felt like a hangar for ideas. Glass walls, clean lines, natural light. No model planes on pedestals, no outdated posters. Just a quiet hum of movement that suggested people were building something worth flying. I stood in the lobby for a moment, unsure why I felt so out of place. Maybe because no one here knew me. No one saw me as the veteran who got pushed out of his own legacy. Here I was just another name on the visitor log. The receptionist smiled warmly. "Captain Merritt, Mr. Tran is expecting you. Top floor." I nodded and stepped into the elevator. It opened directly into a wide sunlit room overlooking the city and the ocean beyond. And there stood Victor Tran, lean, composed, wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up like he was late for something hands-on. He stepped forward and shook my hand firmly. "Captain Merritt," he said. "Thanks for making the time." "Not sure why I'm here, to be honest." "I think you are," he replied. "Have a seat." I did. No formality, no pitch deck, just him and me and the quiet pulse of possibility. "I've heard about what happened at Sierra West," Victor began. "Not just the headlines. Your name came up through someone I trust." "Henry Weston," I said. He nodded. He said, "If you want someone to build a culture, not just a checklist, call Jack Merritt." I said nothing. I wasn't used to being spoken about like I still mattered. "We're building something different here," Victor continued. "Ether Air isn't just luxury charters. It's people-first aviation. Our goal is simple. High-skill crews, low drama, maximum trust. What we don't have yet is a training program, at least not one that reflects what we believe." He slid a folder across the table. "That's where you come in." I opened it slowly. Director of Flight Operations, full control. No middle management buffer, no oversight board micromanagement. Just space and trust. Victor leaned forward. "We don't need a hero. We need a builder. Someone who knows how to start from zero and still bring the sky with him." I looked out the window. The ocean shimmered far below. "I just got grounded," I said. "Thrown out of the only company I ever really gave myself to. And yet," Victor said, "you're here." "I didn't come for revenge." "Good," he said. "We're not offering it, we're offering a blank page." I didn't respond. He added, "Bring anyone you trust, any pilot, any trainer, any first officer who still remembers what this job is supposed to feel like. We'll take them." My, phone buzzed. I glanced down. "Catherine Daffé is here. Sierra West temporarily grounded. Investigators on site. Evan looks like he aged 5 years in one day. I didn't smile. Not really. But something inside me unknotted. I looked back at Victor. You really mean this? He nodded. You won't be answering to investors. You'll be answering to the people you train and the passengers they carry. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like lift. Like the weight in my chest wasn't just dead air. You should know, I said slowly. I fly, not just desks. Victor smiled. Then you'll fly here too, once a month or once a week. Your choice. I picked up the folder again. Ran, my thumb along the edge. Let me think about it, I said. Victor stood and extended his hand again. Take your time, but not too long, because the sky doesn't wait. 3 weeks later, I stood in the doorway of a training facility that hadn't existed a month ago, because I hadn't designed it yet. Now it did, and it was mine. Well, not mine in the legal sense, but every room, every simulator bay, every debriefing corner carried my fingerprints. Open floor plans, no locked offices, state-of-the-art sim units, adjustable cockpit modules for different aircraft types. There were even 2 meditation rooms tucked into the corners, because after 20 years of flying, I knew that sometimes the hardest part of a flight was the silence afterward. Victor stood beside me. He didn't say much, he never did. Just observed, hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face like he could already see the next 10 years mapped out in this building. They're arriving soon, he said. I nodded. Then the doors opened. Catherine. Lowe was first, duffel over one shoulder, civvies instead of uniform. Behind her, Thomas, Daniel, Elena, James, and 24 others, 30 in total. No fanfare, no official announcement, just 30 professionals walking into a room like they belonged there, because they did. I stepped forward to greet them. I didn't prepare a speech, didn't have one ready, but Catherine beat me to it. We didn't leave Sierra West, she said simply. We followed someone we trust. Her voice didn't shake, but something in my chest did. Others nodded. A few smiled. One pilot, Marcus, who I'd trained 5 years ago, simply put his hand on my shoulder in passing, like that one touch said everything that needed saying. Victor leaned toward me, voice low. 30 people in one day, that's not onboarding, that's a message. They're not just coming for jobs, I said. They're coming to reclaim their purpose. A chime echoed from my phone. Henry, Evan stepped down. Board forced it. Lyle under federal investigation. 70% of Sierra West's fleet grounded for audit. I showed the screen to Victor. He read it, exhaled, then nodded. You know what that means? They're going to look for someone to fix it, and they'll call you. They already have, I said. Through Henry. He turned to face me fully. You tempted? I looked at the people unpacking their flight bags, laughing in quiet corners, testing the training gear, pulling up checklists from memory without being told. No, I said. I'm exactly where I belong. Victor smiled. Let me show you the new pilot rec room. As we walked, I let my hand graze the edge of a whiteboard near the main entrance. Someone, probably Catherine, had written a quote in bold marker. Sometimes, leadership isn't about standing in front. It's about standing beside people long enough for them to find their own power. I didn't write it, but I felt it, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like someone who had been pushed out. I felt like someone who had been pulled forward. 6 months later, I was back in uniform, but this time, by choice. The Ether Air flight jacket fit differently. Not tighter or looser, just lighter. Like it didn't come with the invisible weight stitched into every seam. Like it wasn't trying to make me forget who I was before I put it on. I stood on the observation deck of our new international terminal, a cup of coffee in hand, watching Catherine's Dreamliner taxi into position. Her crew moved with that quiet, confident precision you only see in teams who trust each other. She radioed up 15 minutes ago. Tokyo leg completed. Smooth air. All the way, soft touchdown. That was her 3rd long haul as captain. I never doubted she'd get there. But watching her now, I knew she'd gone even further than I imagined. "She's good," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Henry Weston, hands in his coat pockets, looking 10 years older and a little more tired, but still sharp. "She's damn good," I replied. We stood in silence for a few seconds, watching the ground crew swarm the aircraft, beginning their dance of refuel, unload, prep, inspect. A rhythm I knew too well. "They want you back," Henry said quietly. "The board, Sierra West." I didn't answer. "They've lost almost everything," he continued. "Public confidence, crew trust, market share. Evan's gone. Lyle's facing criminal charges. They think bringing you back would change the story." I sipped my coffee. It would, but it wouldn't change the truth. Henry looked over at me. "And what's the truth?" "That the story was broken long before. They pushed me out," I said. "They stopped listening to the people who made it worth flying for. They're offering you the top job, CEO, total control, clean slate." I smiled. "I already have all of that." He didn't argue, just nodded slowly. Down below, the terminal doors opened and Catherine stepped out, laughing at something Thomas said beside her. The crew behind them carried themselves the way professionals do when they know they've earned their wings. Henry followed my gaze. "You built something solid here." "We built it," I said, "together." He gave a small laugh. "I thought I'd be bitter seeing someone else do it better." "You should be proud," I said. "This is what legacy looks like when you stop trying to own it." He looked at me again. "You're not going back, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm already where I'm supposed to be." He nodded. No disappointment. Just understanding. We stood in silence again as the next Ether Air flight began its final checks. The ramp agents saluted. The pilots waved. The aircraft's nose turned toward the runway, engines spooling like a heartbeat ready to lift. "That one's mine," I said. Henry raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think you were flying anymore." "Once a month," I said. "Clause in my contract. Keeps me grounded." "Funny," he said. "Most people fly to get away." I smiled. "I fly to stay connected." The Dreamliner turned onto the active runway. I watched the engines roar to life, watched the body gather speed and confidence, watched it break gravity like it was never meant to stay on the ground. And as it climbed into the blue, I thought about everything we'd lost. Everything we'd built. No revenge, no speeches, just this. A quiet decision to do it right even if no one else would. Sometimes you don't have to tear down what's broken. You just have to walk away and build something better. And then let it fly.